Julian stood frozen in the pouring rain, staring at the $5 million mansion he had built with 10 years of sweat and sacrifice, only to find the woman who gave him life shivering in the backseat of a rusted 2005 sedan parked in the mud. He had imagined his mother Beatrice presiding over the grand dining hall of the estate he funded from across the ocean. But the reality was a cold, jagged blade to his heart. The lights of the villa blazed with a high-end party, the muffled bass of expensive music mocking the silence of the driveway. As Julian approached the shadows, he saw a frail woman with graying hair trying to stay warm under a thin, grease-stained blanket. Her hands, once soft enough to heal his childhood wounds, were now cracked and calloused, clutching a half-eaten sandwich from a gas station. He didn't say a word, his breath hitching in the 40-degree night air, because the secret behind those glowing windows was about to turn his homecoming into a reckoning. The heavy scent of jasmine and expensive cologne drifted from the mansion, clashing with the metallic smell of wet asphalt and old oil leaks near the rusted sedan. Julian reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold, pitted handle of the car door. Inside, the dome light flickered on with a weak, sickly yellow glow, revealing the devastating toll the years had taken on his mother. Beatrice was small, much smaller than he remembered, her frame nearly lost inside a tattered, oversized coat that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin. She flinched at the light, her eyes snapping open with a look of pure, unadulterated terror that broke Julian's heart into a million pieces. She didn't recognize him at first, only seeing a tall man in an expensive suit standing in the rain. She began to scramble, her hands frantically searching for something under the seat, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Julian whispered her name, his voice thick with a decade of unshed tears, and watched as the fear in her eyes slowly dissolved into a confused, painful hope. She reached out a frail hand, touching his cheek with fingers that felt like dry parchment, as if she were trying to verify he wasn't just another cruel dream born of hunger and cold. Before he could pull her into his arms and carry her away from this nightmare, a sharp, blinding beam of light cut through the darkness. The front door of the mansion swung open, spilling a rectangle of warm, golden light onto the muddy driveway. A man stepped out, his silhouette imposing and arrogant, holding a high-powered flashlight like a weapon. It was Marcus, Julian's cousin, the man who had promised to take care of everything. He didn't see Julian standing in the shadows of the car door. He only saw the frail woman cowering inside. Marcus barked a command, his voice echoing with a casual cruelty that suggested this was a nightly ritual. He told her to shut the light off and stay out of sight because important guests were arriving, and he didn't want a homeless vagrant ruining the aesthetic of his driveway. Julian felt a cold, hard rage settle in his chest, a fire that burned hotter than the Florida sun he had worked under for years. He watched as his mother immediately obeyed, pulling her hand away from his face and shrinking back into the darkness of the backseat, her head bowed in total submission. She whispered for Julian to leave, her voice a ghost of the strong woman who had raised him, telling him that Marcus would be angry if he found a stranger near her cage. Julian realized then that the $50,000 he had wired every single month had not been used for medicine or comfort. It had been used to build a prison, and the man he called family was the warden. He stepped back into the deeper shadows as Marcus approached the car, wanting to see exactly how deep this betrayal ran before he tore the whole world down. Marcus walked toward the car with a heavy, rhythmic stride that suggested he owned every square inch of the pavement beneath his designer loafers. He adjusted the cuff of his silk shirt, the diamonds on his watch catching the stray light from the porch and throwing sharp glares into the night. He looked like the definition of success, a man who had mastered the world, but Julian saw only a predator dressed in the finest wool. Marcus stopped a few feet from the sedan, never noticing Julian submerged in the deep shadows of the oak tree nearby. Marcus kicked the tire of the car with a dull thud and demanded to know why the interior light had been on. He shouted that he was tired of Beatrice's ungrateful behavior and reminded her that she was lucky he didn't leave her at the bus station where he claimed to have found her. Julian felt his jaw tighten until it ached, his pulse thundering in his ears like a heavy drum. He watched his mother's silhouette inside the car, her head tucked low, her shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic sob that she was clearly trying to suppress so as not to anger the man outside. Marcus laughed, a cold and hollow sound that lacked any trace of the family bond they once shared. He told her that he was expecting a major investor tonight, someone with enough money to buy and sell this entire neighborhood 10 times over. And he wouldn't let a smelly old woman ruin his chances at a billion-dollar deal. Julian realized with a sickening jolt that he was the investor Marcus was talking about. Marcus had no idea that the golden goose he had been milking for a decade was standing 10 feet away, watching him degrade his own flesh and blood. The contrast was suffocating. Inside the mansion, guests were sipping $200 bottles of champagne and eating appetizers that cost more than the car his mother was forced to call home outside. In the mud and the biting 40-degree wind, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put Julian through school was being treated like a broken piece of furniture. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled $5 bill, tossing it through the cracked window of the sedan. He told her to use it to buy some coffee in the morning and to make sure she was gone before the sun came up because he was planning to have the old vehicle towed to the scrap yard. Julian stepped forward just enough for the light to catch the edge of his polished shoe, his heart set on a path of total destruction. He needed to know how Marcus had convinced the rest of the family that he was the hero while his mother lived in a metal cage. As Marcus turned to head back to the warmth of the party, Julian felt a cold resolve wash over him. The trap was set, but the biggest question remained unanswered. Why was his mother so terrified of Marcus that she wouldn't even call out for her own son? The heavy oak door of the mansion groaned shut behind Marcus, leaving Julian standing in the suffocating silence of the driveway. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, turning the ground into a slick mess of gray slush and mud. Julian looked at the rusted sedan, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for the handle again, his movements slow and deliberate, and this time the door creaked open with a high-pitched whine that sounded like a scream. Beatrice flinched, pulling the grease-stained blanket tighter around her neck, her eyes darting toward the house in sheer terror. She whispered that he had to go, that Marcus would call the police if he saw a stranger loitering near the scrap heap. Julian knelt in the mud, ignored the cold soaking into his expensive trousers, and looked directly into his mother's tired, watery eyes. He told her that he wasn't a stranger, that he was the son who had sent home every cent of his earnings for 10 long years so she would never have to worry again. Beatrice froze, a single tear carving a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. She reached out a trembling finger and touched the scar on Julian's forehead, the one he had gotten from a falling branch when he was 7 years old. Recognition washed over her face like a tidal wave, but it wasn't followed by joy. It was followed by a frantic, desperate urgency. She told him that he was in danger and that Marcus had told everyone in town that Julian had died in an accident overseas 3 years ago. The air in Julian's lungs turned to ice as he realized the depth of the deception. Marcus hadn't just stolen the money. He had erased Julian's very existence to claim the estate as the sole surviving heir. Just as Beatrice started to explain why she hadn't reached out, the front door of the mansion burst open once more. Marcus stood there, framed by the warm light, holding a glass of amber liquid. He shouted into the darkness, asking why that old car was still making noise and threatening to use his shotgun to settle the matter once and for all. Julian stood up, his tall frame emerging from the shadows like a vengeful ghost, and the glass in Marcus's hand shattered on the porch steps. The silence that followed was heavy with 10 years of lies and a brewing storm of justice that was about to break. If you believe Julian should make Marcus pay for every tear his mother shed, please hit the like button and subscribe to see the truth unfold. Also, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Is it Chicago, Toronto, or maybe Johannesburg? We truly want to know. The silence that followed the shattering of Marcus's glass was heavy, a suffocating weight that seemed to press the very oxygen out of the damp night air. Marcus stood on the porch, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of disbelief and a rising, frantic desperation. He squinted into the darkness, his expensive flashlight trembling in his hand as he tried to reconcile the ghost of the man he thought he had buried with the powerful figure standing in his driveway. Julian did not move. He stood like a pillar of granite, his eyes locked on his cousin with a cold, terrifying clarity. Beatrice whimpered from inside the car, her small hands clutching the edge of the door frame as she pleaded with Julian to run, still convinced that the monster on the porch held all the power. But the dynamic had shifted in a single heartbeat. Julian took a slow, deliberate step into the circle of light, his leather shoes crunching on the glass shards that Marcus had dropped. He didn't yell or scream, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble that carried more weight than any shout. He asked Marcus if he enjoyed the house, if the 500 thread count sheets and the $100,000 kitchen were comfortable enough to sleep in while their own blood was rotting in a rusted metal box 30 yards away. Marcus tried to regain his composure, his voice cracking as he bluffed, claiming he didn't know who Julian was and ordering him to leave before he called the security team he paid $5,000 a month to maintain. Julian laughed, a sound devoid of any humor, and pulled a slim, black smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen, and a holographic projection of a bank statement appeared in the air, glowing blue against the dark rain. It showed the direct wire transfers, the millions of dollars that had flowed from Julian's offshore accounts directly into the trust fund Marcus managed. Marcus's eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open as the realization hit him like a physical blow. Julian wasn't just back, he held the leash to every single luxury Marcus had spent the last decade flaunting. The guests inside the mansion began to peer through the windows, their curious faces pressed against the glass, wondering why the man of the hour was shaking like a leaf in front of a stranger in the mud. Julian leaned in close, his shadow stretching long and dark across the porch, and whispered that the party was over. He told Marcus that by the time the sun rose over the Florida coast, every door in this house would be locked against him, and every cent in his accounts would be frozen for investigation. But as Julian reached out to help his mother out of the car, Beatrice grabbed his arm with surprising strength. She whispered that it wasn't just about the money, that Marcus had something else, a secret hidden in the basement that would change everything Julian thought he knew about why he was sent away 10 years ago. Julian looked from his mother's terrified face back to Marcus, who had suddenly turned a ghostly shade of gray, realized that the nightmare was far deeper than a stolen inheritance. The night air grew thick with a new kind of tension as Beatrice's words hung between them, colder and more piercing than the Florida rain. Julian felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature crawl down his spine as he looked at the silhouette of the mansion he had paid for, now realizing it was a monument built on a foundation of bone-deep lies. Marcus took a step back on the porch, his hand groping blindly for the door handle, his eyes darting toward the small, rectangular window of the basement that sat just above the muddy ground. The arrogance had completely drained from his face, replaced by a gray, sickly desperation that made him look like a cornered animal. Julian did not let go of his mother's hand, his grip firm but gentle, as he demanded to know what was under their feet. Beatrice leaned in close, her voice a fragile reed in the wind, whispering that 10 years ago, Julian wasn't sent away just for a better life. She told him that his father hadn't died of a sudden heart attack like the letters claimed, but that he had discovered a secret about the family land that Marcus and his father were desperate to bury. Marcus suddenly found his voice, shouting over the rain that Beatrice was losing her mind from living in the car and that she was making up stories to get attention. He began to laugh hysterically, telling Julian that if he stepped 1 foot inside that house without a warrant, he would have him arrested for trespassing. But Julian wasn't listening to the threats. He was watching the basement window. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound began to echo from the vents near the foundation, a sound that shouldn't exist in a house that was supposed to be empty of everyone except the party guests upstairs. Julian pulled a heavy, chrome flashlight from his tactical jacket and aimed the beam directly at the basement glass. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. There were crates stacked to the ceiling, marked with symbols of a local historical society, and behind them, a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged in a high-security vault. Marcus lunged forward, trying to block Julian's view with his body, but he was too slow. Julian realized that the millions of dollars he had sent home weren't just being spent on luxury cars and silk shirts. They were being used to fund an illegal excavation right under his mother's feet. Beatrice grabbed Julian's coat, her eyes wide with a warning she had carried in silence for 3,000 days. She whispered that the basement wasn't just for storage, and that the reason Marcus needed her out of the house wasn't because of the guests, but because of what was scheduled to happen at midnight. Julian looked at his watch. It was 11:45 p.m. The real reason for the party wasn't a celebration of success, but a distraction for something far more sinister that was about to be moved out of the house forever. Julian stood paralyzed as the clock on the mansion tower chimed 11:45, the deep brass sound vibrating through the soles of his boots. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but he hardly felt the cold, his mind racing to process the terrifying weight of his mother's revelation. He looked at Beatrice, whose face was pale and drawn, her eyes reflecting a decade of silent suffering and a secret that had clearly been eating her alive. She whispered that the excavation in the basement wasn't about treasure or gold, but about evidence that could destroy Marcus and his father's entire legacy. Julian realized that the $50,000 he had been wiring every month wasn't just paying for the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers. It was funding the systematic destruction of his family's true history. Marcus, sensing that the walls were closing in, began to descend the porch steps, his expensive silk tie fluttering in the wind like a dying bird. He shouted that Beatrice was delusional, that she had been wandering the streets for weeks and didn't know what she was talking about. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed a number, threatening to have Julian hauled off to the county jail for trespassing and harassment. But Julian didn't flinch. He walked past Marcus, his stride filled with a terrifying purpose, and headed straight for the basement window where the strange scratching sound had grown louder. He knelt in the wet grass, ignoring the mud staining his custom-made suit, and pressed his flashlight against the reinforced glass. Through the dust and the shadows, he saw more than just crates. He saw blueprints spread across a table, maps of the county that dated back 50 years, and a series of legal documents with his father's forged signature at the bottom. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. They hadn't just stolen his money, they had framed his father for a crime he didn't commit and then used Julian's own hard-earned wealth to hide the proof. Julian stood up, his height towering over the cowering Marcus, and realized that every guest at the party upstairs was likely an accomplice or a silent witness to this charade. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted key fob, a device he had used for high-level security during his years working for the government overseas. He told Marcus that the signal jammer he had just activated would prevent any calls from going out, and that the only people arriving at midnight would be his own legal and security team. Marcus's face turned from a sickly gray to a ghostly white, his phone falling from his hand and disappearing into the slushy mud. Julian turned back to the rusted sedan, his heart breaking as he saw his mother trying to stand up, her legs weak from months of sleeping in a cramped backseat. He promised her that by the time the sun touched the horizon, she would be back in the master suite, and the men who did this would be the ones begging for a place to sleep. But as he reached for the basement door, a heavy black SUV with darkened windows pulled into the driveway, blocking the exit and turning off its headlights. The midnight deadline had arrived 15 minutes early, and Julian realized that the people Marcus was working for were far more dangerous than a greedy cousin with a taste for luxury. The black SUV sat idling at the entrance of the driveway like a hungry predator, its headlights remaining dark while the low hum of its engine vibrated through the wet pavement. Julian stood his ground, his hand instinctively shielding Beatrice as Marcus suddenly found a second wind of arrogance, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. Marcus wiped the mud from his silk trousers and laughed, telling Julian that he was a fool to think a few bank statements could topple an empire built on decade-long shadows. He boasted that the men in that vehicle were not here for a party, but to collect the final shipment of what lay beneath the house, and they didn't take kindly to witnesses or long-lost sons returning from the dead. Julian watched as two men in dark suits stepped out of the SUV. Their movements coordinated and cold, carrying heavy equipment cases that looked far too professional for a simple construction project. Marcus stepped toward them, pointing at Julian and Beatrice, barking in order to clear the driveway so the schedule could proceed without any further interruptions. But Julian remained motionless, his eyes tracking the red light of a security camera he had secretly installed in the oak tree months ago through a local contractor. He told Marcus that the signal jammer wasn't just for phones. It was also a homing beacon for the federal investigators who had been tracking the illegal transport of stolen artifacts across state lines for the last 6 months. The smirk on Marcus's face vanished, replaced by a twitch of pure panic as he realized Julian hadn't just come home to visit his mother. He had come back as the primary informant for a case that was about to blow the roof off the entire county. Beatrice gripped Julian's hand, her voice trembling as she asked if this was why they had threatened to hurt her if she ever mentioned the basement to the neighbors. Julian nodded, his heart burning with a cold fire as he watched the men from the SUV hesitate, their professional demeanor cracking under the realization that they might be walking into a federal sting operation. Marcus began to retreat toward the house, screaming at the guests inside to lock the doors. But the music suddenly cut out, replaced by the terrifying sound of heavy boots moving through the hallways upstairs. Julian realized that the party guests weren't just witnesses, they were the buyers. And the basement wasn't just a storage room. It was an auction house for things that belonged in a museum. As the front door of the mansion creaked open and the first guest tried to flee into the night, a new set of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Julian looked at the basement window one last time, knowing that the secret his father died for was finally about to see the light of day. But he also knew that Marcus still had one final, desperate card to play before the handcuffs were slapped on his wrists. The red and blue lights of the approaching police cruisers began to dance against the white marble pillars of the mansion, turning the pouring rain into a flickering neon nightmare for Marcus. He stood on the edge of the porch, his body trembling so violently that he had to lean against the stone railing to keep from collapsing into the mud. The two men from the black SUV stayed inside their vehicle, their faces invisible behind the tinted glass. But the low growl of their engine suggested they were ready to bolt the moment the first officer stepped onto the property. Julian did not move his gaze from his cousin, his expression as cold and unforgiving as the Atlantic Ocean in winter. He felt Beatrice's small, cold hand tighten around his wrist, her breath hitching as the front door of the house swung open and the first wave of confused party guests spilled out onto the lawn. They were dressed in thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and tailored suits, holding their drinks as they looked from the shivering woman in the rusted car to the man they had hailed as a local hero. Marcus suddenly lunged toward Julian, his voice a desperate, high-pitched screech that cut through the thunder. He began to scream at the crowd that Julian was an imposter, a criminal who had stolen his identity and was now trying to take back a house that he had never earned. He pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice, calling her a senile old woman who had lost her mind years ago and was being manipulated by this stranger. Julian didn't argue. He simply reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a battered, leather-bound journal that had belonged to his father. He held it up in the rain. The ink on the cover faded, but the handwriting unmistakable to anyone who knew the history of this land. Julian told the gathered crowd that this book contained the original deed to the property and the truth about the mineral rights that Marcus had been illegally selling to the men in the black SUV. The air seemed to vanish from Marcus's lungs as he realized the one thing he had been searching for in the basement for 3 years was now in Julian's hands. One of the guests, an elderly man who had been a friend of Julian's father, stepped forward and looked at the book, his eyes filling with a sudden, sharp realization of the betrayal he had been a part of by remaining silent. But just as the first police car skidded to a halt at the end of the driveway, Marcus didn't run toward the officers for protection. Instead, he turned and bolted back into the house, heading straight for the basement stairs with a heavy iron key clenched in his fist. Julian realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that Marcus wasn't trying to hide evidence anymore. he was going to destroy the only thing left that could prove Beatrice's innocence and reclaim their lives before the law could stop him. The heavy iron door at the top of the basement stairs slammed shut with a deafening metallic thud that echoed through the entire mansion, signaling Marcus's final, desperate attempt to bury his crimes in the dark. Julian didn't hesitate, his long strides covering the distance across the foyer in seconds as the screams of the confused party guests faded into a background hum of panic. He threw his entire weight against the door, but it was locked from the inside. The sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place, confirming that Marcus was willing to destroy everything to keep his secret. Beatrice cried out from the entrance, her frail voice pleading for Julian to be careful. But Julian's mind was focused on the rhythmic, frantic sounds coming from behind the wood. He could hear Marcus splashing liquid across the floor, the sharp, chemical scent of gasoline beginning to seep through the cracks in the door frame. Julian realized with a jolt of horror that Marcus intended to set the evidence, the basement, and perhaps the entire house on fire, rather than let the truth come to light. He grabbed a heavy bronze statue from a nearby pedestal and began to batter the hinges, each blow ringing out like a funeral bell for his cousin's hollow empire. Down below, Marcus was screaming incoherently about how the land was his by right and that Julian's father had been weak for wanting to give it back to the community. Julian's blood burned with a righteous fury as he delivered one final, massive kick that sent the door splintering off its frame. He descended the stairs into a cloud of fumes, his flashlight cutting through the dimness to reveal a scene of absolute chaos. Marcus stood in the center of the room, a lit lighter trembling in his hand, surrounded by the crates of historical artifacts and the forged documents that proved the decade-long theft. But Julian's eyes weren't on the lighter, they were on a small, hidden safe that Marcus had pried open in the corner. Inside the safe sat a stack of letters, postmarked from 3 years ago, with Julian's own handwriting on the envelopes. They were the letters Julian had sent when he thought he was dying in an overseas hospital. Letters filled with his final wishes and the location of a secret bank account intended only for his mother. Marcus had intercepted every single one of them, allowing Beatrice to believe her son was dead while he lived off the secret fortune Julian had meant for her survival. The betrayal was so absolute, so cold-blooded, that Julian felt the world tilt on its axis. He realized that Marcus hadn't just stolen money and property, he had stolen 3 years of a mother's life, leaving her to mourn a living son in the backseat of a car while he read her private mail in a palace built on her tears. Julian stood in the center of the gasoline-soaked basement, his heart feeling like it was being crushed by the weight of the letters he held in his trembling hands. The sharp stench of fuel burned his nostrils, but it was nothing compared to the toxic betrayal radiating from Marcus, who stood just 5 feet away with the lighter still poised like a deadly flickering star. Outside, the sirens of the Florida State Police were screaming closer, their blue and red lights flashing through the high basement windows and casting long, rhythmic shadows across the walls. Julian looked at the letters again, seeing his own frantic words from 3 years ago, promising his mother that he was coming home and that he had saved more than enough to buy back their family legacy. Marcus let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, his expensive silk shirt stained with sweat and grease, as he told Julian that he should have stayed dead because the money was already gone, spent on luxury cars, high-stakes gambling, and the very mansion they were standing in. Julian didn't move toward the flame. Instead, he looked Marcus directly in the eyes and told him that the money in the secret account was only half of the truth. He revealed that the account was actually a legal trust that could only be accessed if both he and his mother were present, meaning every dollar Marcus had withdrawn over the last 3 years was a federal crime of identity theft and bank fraud. The lighter in Marcus's hand began to shake as the reality of his situation finally pierced through his arrogance. Julian stepped forward, not as a victim, but as the owner of the ground beneath their feet, and told Marcus that the police were not just coming for the artifacts in the crates, but for the man who had left a 70-year-old woman to freeze in a car while he lived like a king on her son's blood. Beatrice appeared at the top of the splintered stairs, her frail silhouette framed by the warm light of the foyer, and she called out Julian's name with a strength he hadn't heard in a decade. She told Marcus that she had kept her own secret, that she had hidden the original hard drive from the security cameras in the trunk of the rusted sedan, recording every single time Marcus had threatened her life to keep her quiet. Marcus dropped the lighter, the small flame dying before it could touch the gasoline, and he collapsed onto a stack of forged deeds, sobbing like a child who had finally realized his playground was made of glass. Julian reached down and picked up the letters, tucking them into his jacket close to his chest, and walked toward the stairs to carry his mother back into the light. But as he reached the first step, a loud, heavy knock echoed from the front door, followed by a voice that made Marcus freeze in absolute terror. A voice that belonged to the one person Julian thought was still 10,000 miles away. The heavy front door of the mansion creaked open, as if the house itself were groaning under the weight of a decade of deception. Standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the flashing blue lights of the police cars, was a man whose presence made the oxygen in the foyer vanish. It was Elias Dalton, Marcus's father and the uncle Julian had once trusted more than his own flesh. Elias looked older, his expensive tailored suit hanging loosely on his frame, but his eyes still held that cold, predatory glint that had sent Julian halfway across the world 10 years ago. Marcus scrambled toward his father, his voice a frantic, high-pitched whine as he begged for help, claiming that Julian had come back to destroy everything they had worked for. But Elias didn't look at his son with love or pity. He looked at him with an absolute, icy disgust. He walked past Marcus, his heavy leather shoes clicking on the marble floor with a sound like a ticking clock, and stopped directly in front of Julian and Beatrice. For a long moment, nobody spoke, the only sound being the rain hitting the windows and the muffled shouts of officers gathering on the lawn. Elias slowly reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, yellowed envelope that looked identical to the ones Julian had found in the basement safe. He told Julian that Marcus had been lying to both of them, and that he had only just discovered the truth when his own private investigator found Beatrice living in the car 2 days ago. Marcus's face went from pale to a ghostly shade of blue as his father revealed that he had been wiring money for Julian's mother to a secondary account that Marcus had drained in secret for years. The betrayal was a double-edged sword, cutting through every remaining lie until only the raw, jagged truth remained. Julian realized that the entire family had been manipulated by one man's greed, but he also saw the shame in his uncle's eyes for allowing it to happen under his nose. Julian turned to his mother, seeing the way she looked at Elias with a mixture of fear and a long-buried hope for justice. He didn't wait for a courtroom or a judge. He told the officers entering the house to take the hard drive Beatrice had hidden and the bank statements Elias had just produced. Julian felt the burden of 10 years of sacrifice finally begin to lift as he watched the police move toward Marcus, who was now backed into a corner of his own gold-plated living room. Julian picked up his mother, her small frame feeling as light as a feather, and walked past the statues and the silk curtains that his own sweat had paid for. He took her to his own car, a vehicle that actually belonged to him, and told her that they were never coming back to this monument of greed. As they drove away from the flashing lights and the ruins of a false empire, Julian looked at the letters from 3 years ago and realized that while money could be stolen and houses could be burned, the bond between a son and his mother was the only thing Marcus could never touch. The morning sun began to crawl over the horizon, casting a pale, silver light over the quiet suburbs, but the world Julian once knew had been completely dismantled during the night. He sat on the back porch of a beautiful small cottage he had rented far away from the shadows of the mansion, watching his mother Beatrice sleep peacefully in a real bed for the first time in 3,000 days. The silence was no longer heavy with secrets. It was light, filled with the scent of fresh pine and the distant song of birds. Julian held a cup of black coffee in his hands, staring at the newspaper on the wooden table. The front page was dominated by the image of Marcus being led into a federal courthouse in handcuffs, his expensive silk suit wrinkled and his face hidden behind a legal folder. Elias Dalton had followed through on his promise, handing over decades of records that proved the systematic theft of the family heritage and the mineral rights that Julian's father had died trying to protect. The mansion that Julian had built with his blood and sweat was now a crime scene. Its marble floors and crystal chandeliers seized by the state to pay back the millions that Marcus had gambled away. Julian felt a profound sense of relief, but it was tempered by the realization that 10 years of his mother's life could never be truly repaid with money or property. He walked back inside and saw Beatrice sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of cocoa, her eyes finally clear of the fog of terror. She looked at him and smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes, and told him that she didn't need a mansion or a title to feel like a queen. She only needed to know that her son was alive and that the truth was no longer a ghost in the basement. Julian knelt beside her, resting his head on her shoulder, and realized that the greatest wealth he had ever accumulated was the courage to come home and face the darkness. The rusted sedan was already at the scrapyard, being crushed into a small cube of metal, a fitting end for the cage that had tried to break a mother's spirit. As the two of them planned their first real breakfast together, Julian knew that the justice they had found wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming the dignity that greed had tried to steal. This story reminds us that while money can build a house, only love and truth can build a home. If you believe that no one should ever treat their own mother with such cruelty, please like this video and subscribe to join our family for more powerful stories. We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen a family secret tear people apart? Or do you believe that karma always finds its way home? Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey with us.